Welcome to Lecture 2 of Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. In this particular lecture, we'll be looking at behind the text, that part that deals with the background information in the exegetical process, as well as the idea of textual criticism. So let's dive in. What exactly do we mean by behind the text? Well, we're referring to that background information that may seem almost peripheral to a particular text, the kind of information that's found in the first few pages of the introduction of each book in a study Bible, for instance, such as questions of authorship and date and location, audience, questions that may not seem terribly important, but actually have a major impact upon the text. Although we have to ask ourselves, is this really part of Hebrew exegesis? Since anybody could look up that information in a Bible dictionary or a Bible encyclopedia, or again in the first few pages of a study Bible, no knowledge of Hebrew is necessary in those instances. And in that sense, no, this isn't really Hebrew exegesis, but it is a crucial part of exegesis. For instance, understanding who a particular author is may give us insight into why particular Hebrew terms are used. For instance, David is one of the only people in the book of Psalms who refers to the Lord as my shield. Everyone else simply refers to God as a shield or the shield. But David is speaking in the first person, my shield, and will use the Hebrew form of that first person possessive. So in that sense, who David is as the author does impact Hebrew exegesis. The same with location. Some scholars have suggested that there is a northern Hebrew and a southern Hebrew dialect, and we do appear to see certain differences in the text, the most famous being the Ephraimites not being able to say shibboleth or sibboleth, instead confusing one for the other, which ultimately leads to their downfall. So we do have an important impact made upon the text by this background information. So even though it's not strictly Hebrew per se, it does affect the Hebrew text, which is why we need to examine it in greater detail. I've already given an example of David and the Psalms as to why the author of a particular text may be important to the interpretation and to the exegesis of a given Hebrew passage. But that's also true as we consider other texts as well. Ecclesiastes. Not so much is Solomon necessarily the writer of Ecclesiastes, but clearly we're supposed to understand Solomon as the author. And so even if Solomon is not the author, per se, we're supposed to think of the book of Ecclesiastes as being written by Solomon. The same with Song of Solomon. We're supposed to view Solomon as the author. This question of authorship impacts texts like the Pentateuch, where Moses is the author, or the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which has a lot of similarity to the book of Judges, which has caused a lot of scholars to suggest that the same author or the same group of redactors is responsible for everything from Joshua through the end of the historical books. We have to ask the question in the book of Chronicles as to who the author is, because there is a great emphasis upon the temple and upon the Davidic line through the line of Judah. So in each of these instances, the question of author is of utmost importance. We can't simply skip over the question, whether we're reading a prophetic book or a poetic book. We must consider who the author is or who we're supposed to view as the author. We also have to consider date. Not so much the actual dating. For instance, is Moses writing in 1440 or is he writing in 1430? I don't mean date in that instance. I mean, when is the text set in relation to other major events? Is it before Israel makes it into the promised land? Is it before Israel even exists because it's before the time of Abraham? Is it before the time of the exile? Is it post-exile? All of those questions have an impact on the text. And not just when is the text set, as in the date of the setting, for instance, being set pre-exile, but if it can be determined from the text, when is it being written? For instance, we know that the first couple chapters of Genesis are long before Moses, but we also know when Moses lived, so we know when Moses wrote. So as we look at the first couple chapters of Genesis, we have to view them through the lens of an early writing, but then we also have to view them from the lens of when they're actually being written, as Moses is in his day writing events that took place long before him. Each of those questions will make an impact then upon how we understand the text, as we understand the viewpoint of the readers and the viewpoint of the author. in his particular day. Location is also of utmost importance. Moses is writing on the plain of Moab. As other authors are writing, they're writing in their particular situation. Even Proverbs 30, where we're told that it's written by King Lemuel's mother and King Lemuel, and also wondering where in the world is King Lemuel king? We don't really know. But we have to consider the fact that it's outside of Israel. So that Proverbs are not just Proverbs from within Israel, but even taking Proverbs from other Gentile nations and bringing them into the book of Proverbs. The same with Job. The fact that Job as a book is set outside of Israel makes a great impact upon the text, because the interpretation of Job is not just for Israel within a covenantal setting, but is also answering that question about the problem of evil outside of Israel, a universal answer to really a universal question. The prophets, are they northern prophets? Are they southern prophets? Are they talking about the Assyrian invasion, the Babylonian invasion? Are they writing in Samaria? Are they writing in Jerusalem? All of those questions will affect the text and our understanding and interpretation of it. So we have to know, where is it being written and where is it set? And of course, audience. Who is the audience of a particular text? Is the audience northern Israel or is the audience southern Israel? If it's northern Israel, there's a particular group of issues that are being addressed, issues related, especially during the kingship, to the false religion of Jeroboam. If it's the southern kingdom, there's an emphasis upon the temple and the true worship of God in Jerusalem. Which audience is in mind from the prophet makes a great impact then upon our understanding of their emphasis. Are they trying to get rid of the worship of the golden calves in Bethel and Dan? Or are they trying to bring everybody to the temple that exists within their own nation? The same is true of earlier texts. Who is Moses writing to? He's not writing to people who lived in the days of Abraham. He's writing to people that lived in his own day. He's writing to Israel before they enter into the promised land. They're still in the plains of Moab. They're still to the east of the Jordan River. They haven't entered the promised land yet. And that makes a major impact upon the book of Deuteronomy. The same with the later prophets, even after the exile. Who are they writing to? As we read books like Nahum and Obadiah, we have to keep in mind that even though they deal with the Ninevites and the Edomites, respectively, the audience is actually Israel. Those books are not read by the Ninevites or by the Edomites, they're read by Israelites. So the audience, even though it's being addressed, it seems, to other nations, is the people of Israel. They're the ones who are supposed to learn from it, which does affect then our understanding of the text. In addition to dating, which is really focused on when in history a particular text was written or a particular text was set, we also have the question of historical context. Historical context is more related to the events that are going around in the world during a particular date. What's going on in Babylon or Assyria or Egypt? What's going on in world events? Sometimes those world events can explain what's going on in a particular text. For instance, some scholars have suggested that the rise of the Hyksos, some Amorite and Canaanite kings in northern Egypt, is part of what caused Egypt to change its foreign policy and to become afraid of foreigners in its midst. And of course leads to the enslavement of the Israelites for 400 years. We also understand then why various nations would invade, and why for a time sometimes those nations would leave Israel alone, because the Assyrians were being bothered by the Babylonians, or they were being bothered by other nations like the Medes and the Persians, or the kingdom of Urartu, or the Elamites. We understand a little bit about what was going on in the ancient Near East at the time, and that has an impact then on the events within Scripture. We're also able to understand what's going on in the world politically, not just in terms of world events, but even in terms of the way that they made treaties. Much of the book of Deuteronomy is set up like a Hittite suzerain vassal treaty, and we understand that from the historical context of what was going on at the time. Even the impact of the language can have a historical context to it, as we see the increasing growth of the impact of Aramaic, especially as it comes from the Persian kingdom after they invade and take over Babylon. So historical context is an important question as we consider what else was going on around Israel that affected the text in Israel. One of the major questions to consider as we begin a particular book is the reason for writing for that particular book. What is the overarching motivation that the author has for writing down that particular information? For instance, what is the reason for Moses writing the Pentateuch? What is the reason for the writer of Chronicles writing a book about information that we already have in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings? What is the reason that the book of Proverbs is written, or the book of Song of Solomon? What is it that they are trying to instill? Each of these questions has an answer, and that answer may not impact everything within a particular book, but is important enough for us to investigate it and to keep that answer in mind as we're examining the text, because almost every part of a particular book will build up and lead to accomplishing that primary purpose for writing. Thus, we have to keep it in mind. Why was the book written? One of the more difficult parts to ascertain when it comes to the Old Testament is the theological or literary foundations of a particular book. Sometimes in the New Testament, this question is really easy to answer because the theological foundation is Jesus. In the Old Testament, sometimes there is a theological foundation, such as the fact that Deuteronomy is the theological foundation for the book of Jeremiah. In other instances, though, it's a little more difficult to keep in mind what exactly the authors of the book assumed about the theology in the Old Testament era, or what literary foundations they had to draw upon. Again, using Jeremiah as an example, Jeremiah is well aware of Psalm 1 and seems to reference Psalm 1 at least once in the book of Jeremiah. So there is some literary foundation that exists between the Psalter and some of the prophets. But what about some of the other books? It would appear that there are some theological assumptions and some literary works that they were familiar with. For instance, the book of Chronicles is well aware of Kings, is well aware of Genesis, is well aware of other books that came before, and yet also has a major theological assumption. That is the importance of the temple and the line of Judah. And so keeping these in mind allows us to be able to interpret the text through the lens through which they were written, since those literary and theological foundations would have impacted the way that the author wrote. They therefore must impact the way that we interpret. We've covered an awful lot as we've discussed behind the text. We've talked about author, the date of the writing, or at least the implied date of the setting, the location that it was written in, the audience to whom it was written, the historical context of world events, the author's reason perhaps for writing, their theological assumptions, theological works and literary works that they may have drawn upon as they're writing. And yet all of this is really just the background information, setting the stage for the text. If we were the primary audience and we were the ones who were receiving the book as soon as it was written, much of this information would just simply be assumed. We would simply know. But because we are thousands of years removed from the text and removed from the original audience, we actually have to do some investigation in order to be able to answer these questions. Because the answers to these questions will have, at the very least, a subtle impact upon the text. In the assumptions of the text, in the word choice of the text, in the direction of the text, and the application of the text. The text itself is impacted and affected by what lies behind. And so before we can even get into the text to do quote-unquote Hebrew exegesis, we have to first do our background homework. Examine that context so that we know the context in which the text was written and the context in which then the text must be interpreted. Then, having done our homework, are we able to move forward to exegete the text itself? Now that we have dealt with questions behind the text, we're going to shift gears just a little bit to talk about an aspect of the text itself, and that is textual criticism, actually defining what the text is.
When we hear the word criticism in textual criticism, our minds may jump to other forms of criticism that are looked down upon by evangelical scholars, such as historical criticism that automatically assumes that no supernatural events take place. Thus, we need to determine the historical event that's recorded in the Bible, although minus all of the mythological language regarding the supernatural. Or higher criticism, which is interested in determining the history of composition and the sources that were used in the writing of the Old Testament. That's where we get theories such as J, E, D, and P as the four primary sources of the Pentateuch rather than Moses. Again, these are looked down upon by evangelical scholars because of their liberal assumptions, assuming that the Bible is not accurate. Textual criticism, on the other hand, assumes that the Bible is accurate, but also assumes that over time it is possible for mistakes to have taken place in the copying of the text. So what do we do when the text as we have it in the Masoretic tradition, which is found in our Hebrew Bibles, is different from other Hebrew manuscripts, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, or other translations of the Bible, such as the Greek Septuagint? Even the Masoretes were aware of differences between the text as they had it and other potential readings of the same text. Thus, we have a tradition called Ketiv Kare. The Ketiv is what is written. It's the consonantal text. The Kare is the reading, and literally means as it was to be read, that is found out in the either right or left-hand column in the margins of the Hebrew text, where there is a small notation, usually with the letter Kof with a dot over it, indicating that the Masoretes understood that the written text should actually be ignored in this particular instance, and instead their suggested reading would fit the case better. We have these in several places within the Old Testament, almost on every page of the Old Testament. The Ketiv being the actual consonantal text that the Masoretes did not feel comfortable changing, and the Kare as to what they thought it should be. Determining which of these is correct, the Ketiv that's written in the text or the Kare as they read it, is part of textual criticism, determining what is the correct reading. The same when we compare the Hebrew Old Testament with other manuscripts. What is the correct reading? This might raise questions, though, about inerrancy and inspiration. I thought we said that the Bible was inerrant and that the Bible was inspired. So how did there be mistakes? Again, most statements on inerrancy and inspirations refer to the original autographs, the original copy made by the actual author of the text. However, we don't have any of those. What we have are copies of copies, very good copies of copies, but copies that have been handed down for generations and have been copied over and over and over again. And as they're copied, many times there are mistakes that take place, unintentionally in almost every situation, but mistakes that have entered into the text, so that we have variant readings, variant spellings, where words have been changed. Our goal, looking at all the textual evidence that we have, is to get as close as we can to those original autographs. But that means that the reading that we go with may not be the Masoretic text that we have it in our Bibles. Remembering that the Masoretic text is based on a textual tradition that goes back roughly just before the time of Christ, up through about 1000 AD. So while it is an ancient version of the Old Testament, it's really only 1,000 years old. We are trying to get back to figuring out what Moses was writing in about 1900 BC, 4,000 years ago. And to do that, we have to compare our text with other texts to determine the best reading, even keeping in mind that even the font that we use in our particular Hebrew Bibles today is a different Hebrew font than Moses was writing in. So that even then there has been slight mistakes that have taken place as that original ancient archaic Hebrew is brought into a more modern square Aramaic text. Thus, as we look at our Hebrew Bibles, we need to keep in mind that it is the inspired Word of God, but it's an inspired Word of God that has been passed down over generations of copying, generations where we may have potentially inserted errors. And so our goal is to eliminate as many of those as possible. Sometimes just with a Ketiv Kare of determining which is correct, but sometimes comparing whole versions of our books to other books, trying to determine which is the correct version. Again, information in greater detail can be found in Brotzmann and Tully. This will just simply be an overview of how exactly we go about the process of determining the correct text. What exactly do I mean when we compare the Hebrew Bible to other manuscripts? What I mean is that the Hebrew Bible as we have it is based upon a particular manuscript, B19a, the Leningrad Codex. This is not, however, the only ancient copy of the Old Testament that we have. It's just the only complete copy of the Old Testament that we have, which means that other ancient manuscripts may have slight variations that we need to compare our text with in order to determine the correct reading. And so I simply want to highlight some of these manuscripts. As we're reading our Hebrew Bibles, we may oftentimes see a notation that takes us to the bottom of the page to the apparatus that the editor of that particular book of the Hebrew Bible has put in to help us. These indicate other manuscripts that have differences between the Hebrew text as we're reading it and those other manuscripts. Although keeping in mind that the editor only lists other manuscripts that he thinks are important, it is possible that there are indeed other manuscripts that have the same variant or change. So as we're doing textual criticism, we need to do our homework and consult as many different types of manuscripts as we can. And second, because we're using the 4th edition of BHS, he or she do not know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls will never be mentioned in the apparatus as containing any differences. BHSQ, or BHS Quinta, does mention the Dead Sea Scrolls because the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered before the publication of BHSQ. When we look at these footnotes and we see the differences, that calls upon us to use our process of textual criticism to determine if our reading of the text is correct. I'm going to mention just a few of the texts here, both Hebrew and non-Hebrew, but again, you can find more information and greater depth of explanation in Broadsman and Tully. We have the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is the Pentateuch, obviously, that was used by the Samaritans, composed sometime between 100 and 200 BC. It is written in Hebrew, although without vowels, and there are several versions. All the versions, though, only contain the Pentateuch, and they change Mount Sinai to Mount Gerizim to be in line with Samaritan theology. We also have the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the 1940s, probably written in the first 3 centuries BC. Again, there are several versions. In fact, there are some versions that are in Greek, but they are not a complete version. They are instead sections of manuscripts from the entire Old Testament, except for Esther. Again, there are no vowels within the Hebrew text, and the Greek texts are typically from the Septuagint or from extra-biblical texts. We also have the Aleppo Codex, which is one of the best manuscripts that we have. However, it was thought to be lost, and once it was rediscovered, it was found to be damaged, so that almost a third of it is missing. It is a very good reflection, though, of the tradition behind the vowel pointing as we have it. Within non-Greek texts, the most important is the Septuagint, the Greek translation that is from sometime in the first 3 centuries BC. Again, there are several versions of the Septuagint, each of which will be noted differently in the footnotes of the BHS. One of the more important versions of the Septuagint is found in Origen's Hexapla. He actually takes several different versions of the Septuagint, the Vaticanus, the Alexandrinus, and he lines them up with one another and then compares them to the Hebrew text, making it really an early form of textual criticism, so that you can see the various differences between the Septuagints, but also the difference between the Greek and the Hebrew translation. A very important document. We also have Aramaic Targums that are not in Greek like the Septuagint, but actually in Aramaic. They are translations of the Hebrew, but in some places actually contain commentary, again making it very important for what the early Jews understood to be the Old Testament text and their thoughts on it. Later on in the era of the Church, in the first few centuries AD, we have the Peshitta, which is written in Syriac, a version of late Aramaic. This is a very important document, but we need to keep in mind that it is significantly later than the Septuagint and much later than the Dead Sea Scrolls. And finally, we have the Vulgate, which is written in Latin. It is from between 390 and 405 AD and written by Jerome, although Jerome was a great Hebrew student and seems to have had much communication with early Israeli rabbis. And so the tradition that he puts into his Latin Vulgate is not just his own interpretation, but in many times is influenced by those Jews with whom he was communicating. These are the manuscripts that we compare to the Hebrew Old Testament, as well as others that will be mentioned in the footnote, so that we can try to reach at an understanding of what version of the Hebrew text these manuscripts are reflecting or were translating. As we are examining the differences between the Hebrew text as we have it in BHS and any other manuscript, there are several questions that we need to keep in mind. We cannot simply assume that any difference or variance between the Hebrew text and another text is simply a reflection of another Hebrew manuscript. It's possible that the error has crept into the text in some other way. So we need to examine and critique these texts to determine what is the correct reading of the text. For instance, does a variant or a change in another version indicate maybe the challenges of translation? That perhaps there was no target word in the target language to translate the word in the Hebrew. Perhaps Greek did not have a word as equivalent to Hebrew, so that they weren't attempting to change the text, they simply did not have a word to be able to accurately translate it. Or perhaps the variation or the change in the text that is entered in was a deliberate change. We know of at least 18 places in the Hebrew Old Testament where the Masoretes were uncomfortable with what was stated, and so they deliberately changed the text. For instance, in Genesis 18, the text reads that Yahweh stood before Abraham, which seems to make Abraham the superior and made the Masoretes very uncomfortable. So they deliberately changed the text, saying that Abraham stood before Yahweh. Of course, being as meticulous as they were, they noted all 18 times that they made a change and put that in the Mizora Parva, in the column out to the side of the text, indicating that they had made a change. But not all scribes were so meticulous. Many times, a scribe might think that he's fixing the text, or that he's smoothing out the text. He might think that he's actually doing what is correct, and yet actually he's being incorrect, and he's allowing an error to enter into the text deliberately, but not maliciously. It's also possible that a variant has entered into another version or another manuscript through an accidental change. Broadsman and Tully cover these on pages 117 to 129, indicating all the many ways that it's possible for a scribe to either be confused about where he is in the text and to either recopy or to leave something out, or perhaps to misread the text, or even to misunderstand the vocabulary or the script that he's reading, causing changes to enter in accidentally and then be passed on to future generations. All of these are questions that we need to keep in mind as we're reading the manuscripts to try to determine why an error or why a change in a variant entered into other manuscripts. Why is there a difference between what they put and what we find in our Hebrew Bibles? Is it a deliberate change, an accidental change? Is it a translation error? Or are they actually reflecting a different Hebrew text? Once we have become aware of the fact that there is a variant or a change between our manuscript that we are reading in the Hebrew Bible and a different manuscript, whether it be from the indication of the editor in BHS or a Ketiv Kareh reading indicated by the Masoretes, the first step is to collect the various manuscripts. This can be done on the internet and now can even be done through apps on your phone, where you can get access to the Aleppo Codex and to the Dead Sea Scrolls and to the Septuagint. Next, we need to compare. What exactly is the change or the difference between the manuscripts? Are we talking about the difference in one word, the difference in one letter? Are we talking about the difference in tense, or perhaps it was supposed to be she, but now it's been changed to he? What is the change? Then we're able to critique the change, both from the interior, from the text itself, looking to see which variant or which option fits best in the text itself, but also to consider exterior motivations. What is it that caused a scribe to change? Oftentimes we take what is called the lectio difficilior, or the more difficult reading, because scribes had a tendency to make the reading easier. If something made them uncomfortable, they would smooth out the text. Now, this is not always the case, but more often than not, the more difficult reading has been changed to an easier reading. It's also possible that we could have a lectio brevior, which means a shorter reading. Oftentimes, scribes would add words to the text to try to expand and explain the Hebrew text. And so oftentimes we go with the briefest, the shortest reading. Again, neither of those is completely foolproof, but is at least a start. What is the more difficult reading? What is the more brief reading? What is it that would explain the change from one text to all the other texts? Again, we're trying to work backwards, trying to understand how and why the text was changed to those other variants in other manuscripts. So once we have gone through the process of critique, we are ready to choosing what exactly is the correct reading in our opinion. Of course, in some places it is just simply impossible to know, so this choosing may be choosing loosely the best translation or the best reading of the text. Sometimes authors in commentaries will argue for emendation. Emendation is just a big fancy word that means changing the consonantal text. And so they will assume that a change has taken place, and they will try to amend or change the text to what it should be. Unfortunately, in many cases, there is no evidence whatsoever for the change, and they just change because they think it would sound better. Personally, I am rarely convinced that emendation needs to take place. In fact, Peter Craigie has gone so far as to say that he has never seen an instance where emendation was convincing. So before we change the Hebrew text, we need to examine the textual evidence of other manuscripts to see if such a reading exists. We're not making changes to the text simply because they make us uncomfortable. We're trying to determine what is the original text. The question that you may be asking in the midst of all this is, does it really matter? How often do these sort of issues come up? While issues occur in almost every page of the Hebrew Bible, most of them are not significant, perhaps just a difference in spelling. There are some instances, though, where the question of the original text is quite important because of the understanding of the text itself and the impact that it makes on the story. For instance, consider this example from Broadsman and Tully, pages 152 to 153, about the text variations of Ruth and her relationship with Boaz. In the Hebrew version, the workmen say to Boaz as he arrives at his field that Ruth has been resting in the house from morning until that point, indicating that she has not yet started her work of working in the field. The Septuagint says, though, that she has been working in the field and hasn't taken a break at all, indicating that she hasn't stopped gleaning. She's been working the entire time. Remember, the Hebrew text said that she hadn't even started yet. She's been resting in the house and hasn't even left at any point of the day, but has simply been waiting for Boaz to give her permission. The Syriac, which is not mentioned in the textual apparatus, actually says that she started in the field and then she stopped and is resting. So we have a not resting at all. We have a resting, but she's not resting because she started working. She's resting because she's waiting for permission to glean. Or the Syriac of she started and then she is resting. In all of these cases, the one that is probably the accurate one is the Hebrew text, that Ruth has been waiting in the house, has not left at any point, but she's been waiting for permission from Boaz, which he then gives her, in great explanation, which would be kind of odd if she was already gleaning for her to tell her, yes, go glean, and it would be odd in the Syriac for her to start and then stop, because neither of those options is found either in the Greek or the Hebrew. The Syriac seems to be trying to solve the problem of the conflict between the two by creating a third middle option. But in this case, the Hebrew text is most likely the accurate one, telling us that Ruth is resting in the house, she's waiting for permission, she hasn't started yet, but as soon as Boaz gives her permission, she will glean. Hopefully, this quick overview of textual criticism has been helpful in helping you understand how we go about solving the question of what we do when the text is different in other manuscripts, or the text seems a little odd in the Hebrew, as noted by the Masoretes or the editor of the text. Again, we go through this process of collecting other manuscripts, comparing them, critiquing them, and determining what we believe to be the original version of the Hebrew text. We can also then consult commentaries and see what their opinion is, as they too have gone through textual criticism. Again, this is covered in greater detail in both the book by Chisholm and the book by Broadsman and Tully, so I refer you to your reading for more detail, but the general idea is the comparison of texts to determine the original reading of the Hebrew text.
As we come to the end of this lecture, I want to make just a few passing comments on some oddities that we see in the text, typically related to the addition of random letters at the end of words. For instance, at the end of verbs, we often have what is called the pedagogic nun. That's a nun that is affixed to the end of the verb, usually because of pronunciation of the following word, allowing the two words to flow together better. It has no impact upon translation, only pronunciation. So instead of tichyu, you will live, we have tichyun, you will live. Again, likely related to the word that would have followed this particular word in the biblical text. At times, instead of just a pedagogic nun, we actually have a holem vav nun. This can be used as a diminutive, meaning something that is smaller, like when we add the y to the end of a word in English. So shemesh becomes shimshon, which is Samson. Shemesh meaning sun, so sun with a Y on the end, sunny. We can also use that Holam Vav Nun to mean ER or ERN in its English equivalent. So instead of Tachat, which means low, we have Tachton, which means lower. And instead of Kadma, which means east, we have Kadmon, which means eastern. We can also use that Holam Vav Nun to indicate the state of being. So instead of the adjective iver, meaning blind, we have ivaron, which is the state of blindness. Occasionally we'll put a hierarch yod on the end of a noun, not to indicate that it is a possessive, but to indicate that it is an adjective. So for instance, we have ani, which is the state of poorness or being poor, or hafshi, which means free. Again, using that hierarch yod as an indicator of the adjective. When it comes to adverbs, instead of adding a y at the end as in a diminutive or a hierarch yod, we'll actually add a kametz mem, which has the equivalent of putting on an ly in the English equivalent, so that yom becomes yomam, which means daily. Again, day becomes daily, adding that am suffix onto the end. These are just a few of the oddities that you may see in the text, and we'll cover more as we go throughout this series of lectures. Well, that brings us to the end of this particular lecture. We have covered the background information that needs to be examined as part of the exegetical process, as well as textual criticism in determining the correct reading of a text, and a few tips for recognizing things that might be affixed to the ends of various words. That brings us to the end of this lecture. Feel free to go back and watch it as many times as necessary to solidify the material.